The girl who stopped curtsying, Winter in Ashcombe, was a cruel, honest thing. It did not pretend to be gentle the way the people in the great stone houses on the hill pretended to be gentle. The wind came off the moors like a blade, and frost cracked the cobblestones by morning, and nobody in the servants' quarters had a fire lit before 5, no matter how their fingers ached against the copper basins of icy water. Elowen Marsh had learned a long time ago that cold was easier to survive than shame. She had survived both. She had been 11 years old the winter her father's timber business collapsed, not from bad luck, though everyone said it was bad luck, but from something colder and more deliberate that she would not understand for another 7 years. One month her family had a house with glass windows, a cook, and a small library her father read to her from every evening. The next month they had nothing. Her father's signature was on papers he barely remembered signing. Investments turned to dust overnight. Creditors arrived like crows settling on a carcass, patient and unhurried because they knew there was nothing left to fight them with. By the time the dust settled, Edmund Marsh had lost his business, his house, and very nearly his mind, and his only daughter had been sent, through a distant family connection nobody wanted to acknowledge too loudly at dinner, into service at Ashford Hall, the very family whose fortune had, in ways she did not yet understand, grown fatter in the exact months her father's had withered to nothing. 7 years, 7 winters of scrubbing floors in the same house she had once visited as a guest in a blue velvet dress, trailing her fingers along the same banister she now polished on her knees. 7 years of curtsying to children she used to race barefoot across the lawns with, back when the distance between their families had been a matter of manners, not survival. She learned in that time the particular survival skill of the powerless: invisibility, quiet hands, quiet feet, eyes on the floor, servants who make themselves invisible to not get noticed, and servants who do not get noticed do not get hurt. It had worked, mostly, for 7 years. Mostly. There had been smaller cruelties along the way, a hairbrush thrown at her head for arranging curls too loosely, a winter without a second pair of stockings because Lady Cassandra decided the household budget was wasted on people who don't need to look presentable, an afternoon locked in the linen cupboard as punishment for speaking without being addressed first. Elowen had absorbed each one the way stone absorbs rain, quietly, without visible damage, until you looked closely enough to see how it had worn her down. Lady Cassandra Ashford had never once, in all that time, looked at Elowen as anything resembling a person to Cassandra. Elowen was furniture that happened to walk, useful when needed, silent otherwise, replaceable without a second thought, the way one replaces a chipped teacup without mourning it. Cassandra was the only daughter of Lord Reginald Ashford, raised on the particular diet of admiration that convinces a person the world exists solely to agree with them. She was beautiful in the way frost is beautiful, sharp, glittering, and entirely without warmth, the kind of beauty that photographs well and burns anyone who gets close enough to touch it. That should have remained the entire shape of Elowen's life, except for Lord Gideon Ashford. 2. Gideon was Cassandra's cousin, older by 6 years, heir to the Ashford title since a fever had taken his uncle, Lord Reginald's elder brother, the previous spring. He had been raised abroad, mostly in Vienna, sent there as a boy of 9 after his own parents died in a carriage accident on the Dover Road, and he had grown up outside the particular rot of English drawing rooms where cruelty is dressed in good manners and nobody is meant to notice the difference between a compliment and a knife. He returned to Ashcombe In early autumn, with a stranger's eyes, eyes that noticed things the family had spent generations training itself not to see, he noticed within his first week home that the clumsy upstairs maid who dropped a silver tray at his welcome dinner had, in fact, been shoved sideways by Cassandra's elbow beneath the table, a small, deliberate movement executed with the practiced ease of someone who had done it many times before, and that no one at the table so much as blinked. He noticed that this same maid never spoke unless spoken to directly, and that when she did speak rarely and carefully, her vowels carried the shape of an education that should not have belonged to a scullery girl. He noticed the way she flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever Cassandra's voice rose half a register. He said nothing at first. He only watched. It was a habit Vienna had taught him, that the people who talk the least in a room are usually the ones who understand it best, and the people who talk the loudest are usually compensating for something they're afraid others will see. Cassandra was engaged to marry Gideon by the following spring, an arrangement stitched together by their fathers years before either of them had any say in the matter, sealing the Ashford fortune into a single, unbroken line so that no outside blood and no outside scrutiny would ever touch it. Cassandra treated the engagement the way she treated most things, as confirmation of her own inevitability. She wore Gideon's ring the way other women wore a crown, angled always toward the light, and she treated Elowen, on top of her regular duties, as an unpaid personal maid whose sole remaining purpose in life was absorbing whatever temper Cassandra didn't feel like controlling that day. For 2 months, Gideon watched this happen without interfering. He told himself he was gathering information, that a man newly returned to a household he did not yet formally control had no business rearranging its furniture, human or otherwise, before he understood how it had been arranged in the first place. He told himself several other things, too, in the quiet hours before sleep, that were mostly true and entirely insufficient as excuses. 3, there were in those 2 months small moments that lodged themselves in him without his quite realizing it. There was the afternoon he found Elowen in the estate's small library, not dusting, but reading quickly, guiltily, a battered volume of Aristotle she'd pulled from a shelf nobody else had touched in a decade. She startled so violently at the sound of his footstep that she nearly dropped the book into the fire grate. "My lord, I was only—" "Finish the sentence you were about to read," he said, instead of the reprimand she was clearly braced for. She stared at him. "My lord?" "Aloud, go on." She had hands trembling, and her voice, once it steadied past the first few words, was clear and unhesitating in a way that had nothing to do with servitude. He had left the room without comment, but he had gone directly to his study afterward and sat for a long while without picking up his pen, turning something over in his mind that he did not yet have language for. There was the evening he watched her from an upstairs window. Teach a stray dog in the kitchen yard to sit for a scrap of bread, using a low, patient voice, utterly unlike the flat, careful tone she used inside the house, a voice that belonged, he suspected, to whoever she had been before the timber yard collapsed. And there was the morning he asked Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, an idle question about the household's newer staff, and Mrs. Pruitt, a sharp, tired woman who missed very little, had said, Without quite meeting his eyes, "Marsh keeps to herself, my lord. Best that way, given what the family did to her father," and then had gone pale, realizing what she'd said, and changed the subject so quickly, Gideon nearly laughed at the transparency of it. He had not laughed. He had filed it away, the way he filed away everything, and waited. Before the breaking point arrived on the night of the Ashford Winter Ball, the grandest event of the season, the night Cassandra had been anticipating for a full year, the night she intended to be presented formally as the future Duchess of Ashford in front of every family, whose opinion she had ever cared about, and several she hadn't. She required lacing, tighter than usual, tight enough to carve her waist into the silhouette she'd been describing to her seamstress for weeks. Elowen pulled the laces with fingers already aching from 14 hours of work that had started well before dawn, and when her hand slipped, just slightly, exhausted past the point of steadiness, Cassandra spun around and struck her, an open palm across the face, hard enough to split her lip and send her stumbling back against the corner of the dressing table. "You clumsy, worthless little nothing," Cassandra hissed, shaking out her stinging hand as though the injury had somehow been hers to nurse. "Do you understand what you are? You are what's left over after we took everything that mattered from your pathetic family. You should be on your knees, grateful I let you stay in this house at all. Remember that, the next time your hands forget how to work." Elowen said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that saying nothing was the only safe response. But something in her chest, something that had been folding itself smaller and smaller for 7 winters, packed down tight enough to survive, had, at last, reached the end of how far it could fold. She lifted her eyes, not down, not away, directly into Cassandra's face, and for the first time in 7 years, she did not look away first. Cassandra faltered, only slightly, only for a heartbeat, but it was there, unmistakable, the way ice cracks before it breaks, because there is nothing that unsettles a person who depends entirely on obedience, quite like watching obedience simply, quietly, refuse. The bedroom door, left ajar earlier by a housemaid, was open to the hallway. Gideon was standing in it. He had arrived to escort his fiancée down to the ball, and he had seen the entire thing unfold. The slap, the stumble, the blood at Elowen's lip, and the moment Elowen refused to lower her eyes. He did not announce himself dramatically. He said, in a voice quiet enough that it was somehow louder than shouting, "Cassandra, leave us." Cassandra's face cycled rapidly through panic, fury, and then settled into the brittle practice smile she wore for every room she'd ever needed to control. "Gideon, darling, this is a household matter. It doesn't concern—" "It concerns me a great deal," he said. "Leave." She left, her silk skirts hissing against the floorboards like something offended by the air itself. Gideon crossed the room. He did not touch Elowen without permission. He simply crouched slightly, examining the split at her lip with a careful clinical distance that was not tenderness yet, only the sharp focus of a man cataloging evidence. "How long has this been happening?" he asked. "It doesn't matter, my lord. It matters to me." He straightened, studying her properly for what felt like the first time, not as furniture, not as a shape folded into the corner of a room, but as a person standing in front of him with blood at her lip and something like steel newly visible in her spine. "What is your name? Your real name? Not girl, not you there." "Elowen Marsh, my lord." Something shifted behind his eyes. Recognition, cold and slow, like ice forming on still water. "Marsh," he repeated, "as in Edmund Marsh, the timber merchant who lost everything to my uncle's investment scheme 6 years past." Elowen's silence was answer enough. "I see," Gideon said softly, and in that quiet, terrible moment several things reorganized themselves in his mind at once. His late uncle's mysteriously expanded fortune, his own unexplained inheritance, the debts of families like the Marshes, that had quietly vanished into the Ashford accounts over the years and never come back out the other side. He did not sleep that night. Instead, once the ball had wound down and the last carriage had rattled off into the dark, he sat alone in his late uncle's study with a decanter he didn't touch, going through ledgers that had been locked away since the funeral, their leather spines stiff with disuse. What he found by dawn turned his stomach. A full decade of deliberately engineered ruin, rigged investments, sold to trusting men at exactly the moment their businesses were most vulnerable, timed and structured so that when they collapsed, the Ashford family was perfectly positioned to purchase the wreckage, the land, the mills, the shipping contracts for a fraction of what it was worth. The Marsh family had not lost their fortune to misfortune. It had been engineered on paper in his own late uncle's meticulous hand. The Whitfields, the Corbins, four other families besides, all quietly dismantled and folded into the accounts that now, technically, belonged to him. By the gray light of morning, Gideon had made a decision that would end his engagement, unravel his family's reputation in every drawing room from Ashcombe to London, and dismantle everything Cassandra believed she was entitled to own. 6. He summoned Cassandra and her father, Lord Reginald, to the study before breakfast had even been laid. "I've spent the night reviewing my late uncle's private ledgers," Gideon said, sliding the heavy leather book across the desk without ceremony. "The Marsh family's ruin, the Whitfields, four others besides, all of it engineered, all of it documented in his own handwriting." Lord Reginald's face drained to the color of ash. "Those records were meant to be destroyed years ago." "They weren't," Gideon said. "And I intend to make restitution to every family my uncle deliberately destroyed, beginning with the Marshes." He turned to Cassandra, whose face had gone rigid with something between fury and disbelief. "I'm also dissolving our engagement." "You cannot be serious." Cassandra's voice cracked at the edges, the composure she'd worn her entire life suddenly visibly a costume. "You're doing this for a servant?" She fumbled during lacing, I corrected her. "And you're prepared to throw away everything we—" "I'm not doing this for her," Gideon said, though even as the words left him, he understood they were only half true. "I'm doing this because the foundation of everything this family owns is built on theft, and I refuse to marry into a lie now that I know its exact shape." "You'll destroy us," Lord Reginald said, finding his voice at last, low and desperate. "The scandal alone, you destroyed 6 families first," Gideon said. "I'm simply the first Ashford in a decade willing to admit it out loud." 7. The engagement was broken within the week, publicly and scandalously, the news traveling through London society faster than any coach could carry it. The Ashford name, once spoken with envy, began to be spoken with suspicion, then with something close to relish. The particular relish society reserves for watching a family it once envied come apart in public. Investigations were quietly opened by men Gideon himself had written to. Creditors who had once bowed to Lord Reginald began circling instead, sensing weakness the way animals sense a wound. Cassandra, her prospects diminished overnight by scandal, was married off within 2 months to a minor baron in Yorkshire twice her age, a man known more for his damp manner and his gout than for his charm, in a ceremony attended by almost no one who had once fought for an invitation to hers. Elowen, meanwhile, received a formal letter one gray morning in early winter, delivered not by a footman, but by Gideon himself. It restored in full the deed to her family's old timber yard, along with a settlement generous enough to rebuild the business from the ground up, and a formal written apology from the Ashford estate, the first of its kind in the family's history. "You didn't have to bring it yourself, my lord," she said, staring at the paper with hands that had gone unsteady. I wanted to see your face when you read it, Gideon admitted. I've spent a month watching you disappear into the corners of rooms you should have been standing in the center of. I wanted just once to watch you take up space instead. Elowen looked up at him, really looked, the way she had trained herself out of doing for 7 years, because looking at a lord too long had always been dangerous for a maid. I don't know how to be anything but careful, she admitted quietly. Then perhaps we'll learn together, Gideon said. I don't know how to be anything but the man my uncle raised me to replace him with. Perhaps neither of us has to stay, way we're told to be. VII, they did not marry. Immediately, Elowen insisted on returning home first, to the small rented cottage her father had taken after the ruin, to help him reopen the timber yard with her own hands blistered from sanding new signage, to reclaim piece by piece the ordinary dignity of a life that had been stolen from her before she was old enough to understand what theft looked like. Gideon let her go without argument, though he wrote to her every week, plain, unromantic letters about estate business and the weather, and occasionally a single line that gave away more than the rest of the page combined. The house is quieter without the sound of someone pretending not to exist in it. It was 7 months before he rode out to the timber yard himself, unannounced, boots dusty from the road, and found her exactly as he'd first truly seen her, sleeves rolled, hands busy, giving orders to a yard full of men twice her age, who had, somewhat to their own surprise, learned to take them. You've come to check on your investment, she said, not quite hiding her smile. I've come, he said, because I find I've run out of patience for waiting. He asked her properly that day, in the sawdust and the cold autumn light, with none of the ceremony his family's weddings usually demanded. She said yes before he'd finished the question. Ikes. They were married the following spring, not in the gilded Ashford family chapel with its rows of gossiping guests, but in the small stone church beside the rebuilt Marsh timber yard, sawdust still faintly sweetening the air, her father standing straight-backed and steady for the first time in 7 years, weeping openly through the entire ceremony in a way that made Elowen laugh instead of cry. Life at Ashford Hall afterward was not, at first, easy. The staff who had watched Elowen scrub their floors for 7 years did not know how to curtsy to her, and she did not know how to be curtsied to. She solved it the only way she knew how, by working alongside them rather than above them, reorganizing the household accounts herself within her first month as Duchess, uncovering and correcting years of quiet waste and petty theft by a steward who had assumed no one would ever check his figures again. She was not feared for cruelty. She was, for the first time in the house's long history, respected for competence. Cassandra, from her damp Yorkshire manor, sent one letter, months later, bitter, brief, unanswered. X. Some people spend their whole lives curtsying just to survive the room they're standing in. Elowen Marsh learned finally that the moment you stop lowering your eyes is the exact moment the world is forced to look back. And sometimes, if you are patient and if you are lucky, the moment someone finally looks back with you instead of past you.